the Must-See Film Club.
Let's start on a single, unbelievable day, March 2nd, 1933.
Okay, I'm with you. In New York City, there's a massive double premiere for a new adventure film. It's playing at both the 6,200-seat Radio City Music Hall and the Roxy Theater. 50,000 people show up on the first day alone.
An absolute smash hit in the making. But on that exact same day, the studio behind the film, RKO Radio Pictures, officially goes into receivership. They are, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt.
That is incredible. The premiere of what would become one of cinema's most iconic films happens on the very day its studio financially collapses. The stakes could not possibly be higher. The film isn't just a movie, it's a lifeline.
Exactly. And the film, of course, is King Kong. The entire future of a major Hollywood studio is resting on the furry shoulders of an 18-inch puppet. To understand why RKO was so desperate, we have to remember this is the absolute depth of the Great Depression. Audiences wanted escapism, but studios were bleeding money. And King Kong was not a cheap film.
Not at all. The budget is reported as being somewhere between $600,000 and $672,000. That's a huge sum for the time, especially for a studio on the brink of collapse. This was a massive gamble on a completely unproven concept.
It's a gamble driven by two visionaries, Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack. They wanted to create something no one had ever seen before, a modern fairy tale, a Beauty and the Beast story, but with a terrifying primal force at its center.
And they poured everything into it. The research notes that the studio, even with that big budget, was hesitant to pay for a full original musical score. So what does Cooper do? He pays composer Max Steiner $50,000 out of his own pocket to create one.
That's conviction. He knew the sound was just as important as the spectacle. Steiner's score is now considered one of the all-time greats, a landmark that showed how music could drive the emotion and terror of a film. Cooper wasn't just making a monster movie, he was orchestrating an entire sensory experience.
The whole production feels like it's fueled by this intense, almost reckless creative passion. The film is built around the work of one person in particular, the special effects pioneer Willis O'Brien. He had done some earlier work with dinosaurs in The Lost World, but this was a completely different level of ambition.
He was tasked with not just creating a giant ape, but making audiences believe in him, making them fear him, and maybe even feel for him. And the way he did it essentially wrote the rule book for visual effects for the next 50 years. So let's get into the how. How did they pull this off in 1933? The centerpiece, of course, is stop-motion animation.
Right. Willis O'Brien and the model maker Marcel Delgado built several puppets of Kong, the primary one being just 18 inches tall. It had an articulated metal skeleton, almost like a Terminator, which was then layered with cotton, rubber for muscles, and finally a painstakingly applied coat of rabbit fur.
And the process is just mind-bogglingly tedious. An animator moves the puppet's arm a fraction of an inch, takes a single frame of film, moves it again, takes another frame. 24 frames for 1 second of movement. The research says the animation alone took 55 weeks.
Wait, it gets even more granular. The iconic fight scene between Kong and the T-Rex, which is only a few minutes long on screen, took 7 full weeks to animate. 7 weeks of infinitesimal adjustments and single-frame captures.
This is wild. And they had to invent tools to even make it possible. They used something called a surface gauge to keep track of where the models were from frame to frame. It was a simple tool, but it was crucial for maintaining continuity so Kong didn't look like he was jittering all over the place.
But animating the puppet is only half the battle. The real magic, the true revolution, was integrating that puppet with live-action actors. How do you make it look like an 18-inch model is holding a real, screaming Fay Wray?
This is where O'Brien's genius comes in. He combines multiple techniques. You have matte paintings, literally paintings on glass, to create the epic Skull Island backdrops. Then you have rear projection, where footage of the actors is projected onto a screen behind the stop-motion models.
It's like an early, analog version of a green screen. They also developed a technique called miniature rear projection, where they could project tiny images of the actors into the miniature sets, making the integration even more seamless.
And they also use these incredibly complex optical printing techniques with names like the Dunning process and the Williams process to layer different pieces of film on top of each other. Live actors in the foreground, Kong in the middle ground, a matte painting in the background, all composited into one shot.
And when they needed a close-up, they went big. They built a massive, full-scale mechanical hand and a giant bust of Kong's head and shoulders. The shoot with Fay Wray in that giant hand was apparently grueling, lasting 22 hours straight as she was lifted and dropped over and over again.
You can see why a Variety review at the time noted her constant screaming was almost too much for an audience. It was probably too much for the actress, too. But all that pain, all that meticulous frame-by-frame labor resulted in something that audiences in 1933 found utterly, terrifyingly real. So, we have this technical masterpiece born of desperation. Does the gamble pay off for RKO?
It pays off in a way that is hard to overstate. Remember, the studio went into receivership on opening day. The film's initial box office haul was around $1.76 million, giving RKO a profit of $650,000. On a budget of around $672,000, that's almost a 100% return in its first run.
That's the money that literally saved the company. It pulled RKO back from the brink of oblivion. The total box office eventually reached $10 million in its lifetime, which is just a staggering figure for the era.
What's fascinating strategically is that King Kong didn't just save one studio. It created a playbook for a new kind of filmmaking. It proved there was a massive market for effects-driven, high-concept spectacle. It's the blueprint for the blockbuster.
That's a great point. Before Kong, spectacle was often historical epics. Kong blended adventure, horror, fantasy, and even tragedy into a new kind of package. The structure itself is a template, the mysterious journey, the discovery, capturing the monster, bringing it to civilization, and the inevitable tragic climax where civilization destroys what it doesn't understand.
We see that pattern over and over, and the film's financial success had this long tail. It was re-released in 1952, where its profits ballooned to nearly $3 million. This showed the studios the power of durable intellectual property, something you could re-release and monetize for decades.
This 1952 re-release is a key moment. It didn't just make more money, it inspired a whole new generation. A young Ray Bradbury saw it, and it influenced his short story The Foghorn, which was then adapted into the film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
And The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is considered the film that directly kicked off the giant monster boom of the 1950s in America. And in Japan, it was a huge inspiration for a certain film called Godzilla. The lineage is direct. The monster that saved RKO ended up spawning an entire global genre.
Beyond its technical and financial impact, the film has had this incredibly rich and often controversial interpretive life. People have been arguing about what King Kong actually means for 90 years.
Absolutely. On one level, it's a straightforward parable: civilization versus nature. Kong is the pure, primal force of the natural world, and he's ultimately destroyed by the cold, mechanical instruments of modernity, the airplanes.
But then there's the Beauty and the Beast angle, which Cooper himself pushed. It's a fairy tale structure, but it's a tragic one where the Beast's affection isn't reciprocated, and it leads directly to his downfall. The famous last line, "It was Beauty killed the Beast," frames the entire story as a tragedy of misplaced love.
This is where the narrative really deepens, because for the first time, audiences were asked to sympathize with the monster. O'Brien's animation gives Kong so much personality, curiosity, rage, even tenderness. He's not just a destructive force. He's a character. He's a protagonist. And his death on the Empire State Building is genuinely moving.
Which leads us to the most contested interpretation, the racial subtext. It's impossible to ignore the imagery of a giant, dark-skinned creature taken from his home in chains, who becomes fascinated with a blonde white woman and is then killed by the authorities for it.
It's incredibly potent, and many cultural critics see the film as a deeply coded reflection of racial anxieties in 1930s America. The research even found a review from 1933 that pointed this out, saying that in, say, 100 years' time, it will become all the more difficult to ignore the racial subtext of the entire production. That's astonishingly prescient.
It really is, and it creates this unresolved tension. Is Kong a tragic romantic hero? Is he a symbol of nature destroyed by greed? Or is he a problematic metaphor for racial fears? The film supports all of these readings simultaneously, which might be why it remains so powerful and unsettling.
And the film itself was controversial at the time for its violence and intensity. In the pre-Hays Code era, it pushed boundaries. Censors famously cut several scenes, like one where Kong shakes sailors off a log and they're eaten by giant spiders. These scenes weren't restored until decades later, but they show the filmmakers were aiming for raw, visceral horror, not just adventure.
So when you trace the legacy of King Kong, it's not just one path. It branches out in so many different directions.
Exactly. There's the technical lineage, which is probably the most direct. Willis O'Brien mentored a young Ray Harryhausen, who took stop motion to incredible new heights in films like Jason and the Argonauts. And Harryhausen, in turn, inspired an entire generation of filmmakers: Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Peter Jackson, Guillermo del Toro. The DNA of Kong's effects is in almost every modern blockbuster.
Then there's the genre lineage. As we said, without King Kong, there is likely no Godzilla. Eiji Tsuburaya, the special effects master at Toho Studios, explicitly cited O'Brien's work as his primary inspiration. Kong gave Japan the language and the ambition to create its own national monster myth.
It's amazing to think that the creative seed for the entire kaiju genre was planted on Skull Island. And it came full circle pretty quickly, with 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla, a mashup that started as an idea from Willis O'Brien himself, originally titled King Kong vs. Frankenstein.
But maybe the deepest legacy is thematic. King Kong established the trope of the sympathetic monster. It taught filmmakers that you could make audiences root for the creature, that the real monsters were often the humans exploiting it. In this case, the showman Carl Denham, who captures Kong for profit.
That's the core of so many great monster stories that followed, from Frankenstein's creature to the raptors in Jurassic Park. We are fascinated by these powerful, unnatural beings, but we also recognize our own culpability in their creation and their suffering.
It's a film that, for all its 1930s-era flaws and troubling subtexts, managed to create a true modern myth, a story of wonder, terror, greed, and tragedy that feels just as massive and elemental as the creature at its heart.
The Eighth Wonder of the World, a title given to Kong in the film, but it really applies to the movie itself. A landmark of technical ingenuity and narrative power that roared onto the screen in 1933 and, in many ways, has never left.